Anakin Skywalker routinely sent 3 Venators to decide the fate of entire star systems. But the one time the Open Circle fleet deployed everything it had, it wasn't for a planet. That line lives inside a specific disagreement. The argument the original video on the Venator made was an engineering argument. Kuat Drive Yards built a capital ship with structural compromises woven into its design brief, and those compromises shaped outcomes on hundreds of battlefields across a 3-year war. The argument had genuine weight. The Venator's dual-role architecture created real trade-offs. Its armament was politically constrained. Its internal architecture had gaps that determined adversaries could find and exploit. These aren't invented criticisms, and they aren't wrong. But the original video never named Anakin Skywalker. Not once. For a piece about a ship whose primary operational fleet, the Open Circle Armada, spent 3 years of galaxy-wide warfare under his command, that's an editorial decision that shapes what the analysis can and can't see. You can't evaluate the Venator's combat record without evaluating the command philosophy that decided when it fought, where it fought, and what it was asked to do. Evaluating the hardware without the command layer is like reading a casualty report and noting the weather. This script doesn't dismiss the engineering argument. The Venator had real trade-offs, and the political constraints that produced them were genuine. But it builds the parallel case, that the outcomes across the Venator's operational life, victories and catastrophic losses both, were shaped at least as much by who stood on the bridge as by anything in the design specification. Sometimes the variable was a Jedi general operating at the outer edge of his strategic brilliance. Sometimes it was the same Jedi general operating on fear for someone he loved. Sometimes it was a 10-year-old with a grudge and a very specific plan. The commander's argument doesn't rest on reading the audience's mood about which question the original video missed. It rests on what the record actually shows. By the end, you're going to have to decide which argument the evidence supports. A clean resolution isn't available. The record is too complicated for one. Start with what Kuat Drive Yards actually delivered. The Venator-class Star Destroyer runs 1,137 to 1,155 meters from bow to stern, a wedge of durasteel longer than most planetary capital buildings are tall. Starfighter capacity, up to 92 various types, launched from a long dorsal flight deck whose retractable armored bow doors dominated the ship's upper surface. Armament included DBY-827 heavy turbolasers, capable of 7 distinct blast intensities, backed by at least 52 point defense laser cannons, 4 proton torpedo launchers, and 6 tractor beam projectors. The hangar bays carried not just fighters, but 20 to 40 LAAT gunships and 24 ATTE walkers, meaning a single Venator could deliver a full, combined arms ground assault without requiring a dedicated transport anywhere in the battle group. The ship was its own task force in a metal shell. Wikipedia's designation for the class is the critical phrase, attack cruiser and carrier simultaneously. Not one or the other, both. That dual identity is the spine of the engineering critique, and it's not an unfair reading. A ship designed to fight in the line of battle and operate a carrier wing is a ship optimizing partially for 2 things, rather than fully for one. The doctrinal tension is real. Carrier operations require holding position, protecting the flight deck, and keeping point defense batteries cycling to screen your own assets. Line of battle operations require accepting hull hits and pressing heavy gun batteries at close range. These requirements don't coexist easily, and the designers knew it. The ship's 52 point defense cannons were serious against fighter screens, substantial in the right formation. But the Venator was designed to operate inside a battle group, not as a standalone platform facing a coordinated swarm strike without support. Whether that gap is an engineering failure or a doctrine failure depends entirely on what the ship was supposed to be flying alongside, and whether those other ships were actually present. Going back roughly 1,000 years before the Battle of Christophsis gets you to the Rusan Reformations. The Reformations followed an era of devastating regional conflicts. war severe enough that the Republic had started functioning more like a military alliance than a civilian government. The political response was comprehensive demilitarization. The Republic's ability to procure and arm military hardware was legally constrained by institutional frameworks that accumulated across the next 10 centuries of relative peace. By the time Kuat Drive Yards was drafting the Venator specification sheets, that legal apparatus was 1,000 years of legislative momentum, not a current political debate, but a structural baseline that everyone in the procurement process treated as simply how things worked. Armament levels for Republic military vessels weren't determined solely by what engineers wanted to build or what fleet commanders wanted to carry. They were filtered through what the Republic's legal framework permitted a government warship to carry, in a context where that framework had been designed to prevent exactly the kind of military buildup that was now urgently necessary. The galaxy had changed. The legal structure hadn't. So when the Venator's turbolaser batteries seemed light for a ship of 1,155 meters, that's not KDY cutting corners on a profitable contract. That's the Republic's legal definition of what a military vessel was permitted to be, translated into hardware by engineers who were working within constraints they didn't author. The ship was as armed as the political system that commissioned it was willing to allow. If the Venator was underarmed for the war it was asked to fight, the question is whether KDY made a design choice or implemented a political constraint. The evidence points toward the latter. The engineers were solving the problem they were given: build a ship capable of projecting Republic power across a galaxy-wide conflict within the armament limits the Ruusan reformations established. The Venator is the answer to that problem. Whether the problem was correctly stated is a different question, and the people who stated it incorrectly were in the Senate, not in Kuat Drive Yards design halls. What is on KDY is something else, and it gets addressed in a moment. The Open Circle Fleet, officially the Open Circle Armada, operated as one of the Republic Navy's primary combat formations from the war's opening months through its final weeks. Co-commanded by Jedi Generals Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker, its identity was marked literally on every soldier who served in it. The Open Circle symbol, a circle with a deliberate gap, appeared on the shoulder markings of clone officers aboard every ship in the formation. The command structure had two distinct layers. Anakin ran a subordinate task force, referred to in the records as Skywalker's Fleet, within the larger armada. Admiral Wolf Yularen served as the senior naval officer in that task force, the institutional Republic Navy professional handling fleet operations, while Anakin provided overall command direction. The Republic Navy's own organizational doctrine stated explicitly that Venator-class Star Destroyers served as the anchors of task forces within the Open Circle Armada. Anakin's flagship was the Resolute, a Venator class. The ship wasn't incidental to the fleet's identity, it was structural to it. By the Battle of Ringo Vinda, the Open Circle Armada had at least 20 Venator-class Star Destroyers deployed in a single engagement, alongside Acclamator-class assault ships, Arquitens-class light cruisers, and Consular-class cruisers. This wasn't a peripheral formation. The Open Circle Fleet was at the center of the Clone Wars' defining naval engagements: Christophsis, the Malevolence Campaign, Ringo Vinda, the Battle of Coruscant, the Outer Rim sieges. Obi-Wan commanded his own parallel task force within the Armada, with a more conventionally doctrinal approach. The Labyrinth of Evil novel documents the tension between their command philosophies as something that had stood at the center of their conflicts for years. That institutional counterweight mattered, because Anakin's approach to fleet operations wasn't Obi-Wan's. At Christophsis, Anakin deployed 3 Venators, his flagship Resolute, and 2 additional Star Destroyers, as a coordinated tactical unit. The Labyrinth of Evil also separately documents a trio of wedge-shaped Venator-class assault cruisers operating as a distinct grouping during the approach to Coruscant. 2 documented instances, different battles, same structure. Whether those 3 ship groupings represent codified Republic fleet doctrine, a written specification, isn't confirmed by any primary source in the record. What's confirmed is the pattern. Anakin deployed at this scale consistently enough that 3 Venators registers as his working baseline for an engagement requiring serious force projection without full fleet commitment. The Malevolence campaign shows his command philosophy most clearly. The Subjugator-class heavy cruiser Malevolence was hunting Republic fleets with its ion cannons, disabling entire formations before finishing them at leisure. A conventional broadside engagement against something that could neutralize your weapons and shields before the first exchange was effectively a planned loss. Anakin didn't run a conventional engagement. He led a Y-wing attack squadron directly at the ion cannons themselves, through the Malevolence's defensive envelope, under heavy fire, accepting high attrition risk to the attacking formation in exchange for destroying the specific capability that made the enemy ship dangerous. The ion cannons came down. The Malevolence lost its decisive advantage. The battle turned. That sequence establishes the consistent signature across Anakin's command record. Identify the specific capability that makes the opponent dangerous and eliminate it through the shortest available route, regardless of how unconventional or costly that route appears. It works brilliantly when the identification is correct and the execution is fast enough. It fails catastrophically when either condition isn't met. Under Anakin's command, the identification was almost always right, and the execution was almost always fast. The question is, what happens when the capability being neutralized isn't tactical? When the threat isn't an ion cannon? When it's a person he loved? Season 6 of The Clone Wars runs a 3-episode arc through Scipio that begins as a financial corruption investigation and ends as one of Palpatine's most consequential coups. In An Old Friend, Padmé Amidala arrives on Scipio on what presents as a mercy mission and is recruited by Rush Clovis to investigate banking clan corruption from within the institution. By The Rise of Clovis, Dooku has maneuvered Clovis into the banking clan's leadership position. In Crisis at the Heart, which aired March 7, 2014, a separatist invasion fleet drops out of hyperspace above Scipio. Padmé alerts Republic forces before being captured. Anakin leads the Republic response, defeats Confederate units in the space engagement, secures Scipio, and personally extracts Padmé from Clovis's office during the battle. Rush Clovis falls to his death. Banking clan holdings transfer directly to the Chancellor's office, meaning Palpatine has just acquired personal control of the galaxy's financial infrastructure through an operation the Republic just paid for. One reading of the Battle of Scipio frames it as strategically sound. The banking clan's network was a critical component of the separatist war economy. A separatist fleet appearing above a financially strategic planet justified a serious Republic response. One commenter in the discussion around the original video made exactly this point, noting the battle secured the entire financial structure of the Republic. That's a legitimate assessment of the outcome, and it deserves to be stated before the other reading follows. But the arc's emotional engine isn't the banking network. The episodes don't try to obscure what they're actually about. Anakin's jealousy over Rush Clovis, over his proximity to Padmé, over the time they'd spent together on Scipio, is an explicit narrative driver across The Rise of Clovis and Crisis at the Heart. The confrontation between Anakin and Clovis in The Rise of Clovis isn't subtext. Anakin attacks him, violently, over Padmé, in front of Padmé. The show puts this on screen without softening it because that is the story those episodes are telling, and they intend you to register it. Anakin and Padmé were secretly married. Ahsoka Tano suspected the relationship, but appears not to have known its full extent. Admiral Yularen was the institutional counterweight in Anakin's task force, the Republic Navy professional whose function included, at minimum, ensuring fleet operations followed sound military procedure. Whether Yularen had standing to question the scale of the Republic response to a mission where the commanding Jedi's wife had been captured on the surface isn't a question the record answers. What the record shows is that Anakin personally executed Padmé's extraction from Clovis's office, rather than delegating it to the clone troopers available, a decision that, tactically, removed the commanding general from the larger engagement to perform a company-level rescue mission on a specific floor of a specific building. The fleet count at Scipio isn't verified in any primary source, The number of Venators Anakin committed to that engagement can't be confirmed from the available documentation. What can be confirmed is the behavioral pattern the arc explicitly portrays. A commander whose strategic calculus and personal calculus were running simultaneously during the operation, and not always in separate compartments. The commander's argument doesn't require proving Scipio was strategically unjustified. The strategic justification was real, and the outcome was significant. It requires only noting the difference between the Anakin who ran the Malevolence campaign, analytical, cold, targeting the specific vulnerability through the fastest available route, and the Anakin the Scipio arc explicitly portrays, a general whose primary concern on the ground during the battle was a specific person in a specific room. Both of those commanders are the same person, flying the same fleet, aboard the same Venator-class flagship. The hull doesn't change based on the commanding Jedi's emotional state. The decision of how many hulls to commit, and what the commanding Jedi does with his body during the engagement, does. Whether the Battle of Scipio reflects sound Republic fleet doctrine applied to a legitimate strategic objective, or a personal commitment level that outran the doctrinal requirements of the mission, or both simultaneously, that's the gap the engineering argument can't close from either direction. And it's the gap the original video left entirely open by never naming Anakin Skywalker once. Some of the Venator's most consequential losses had nothing to do with fleet action. They were decided inside the hull, by actors who weren't fighting the ship, they were fighting their way through it. The first was approximately 10 years old. Jango Fett died on Geonosis at the hand of Mace Windu. His son Boba was present in the arena stands. He watched the execution. He walked out of Geonosis carrying a vendetta, and for years he carried it patiently, waiting for the operational capability to match the objective. By Season 2, Episode 20 of the Clone Wars, the plan was ready. The Clone Youth Brigade was a training formation, young clones being evaluated for eventual battlefield deployment, rotating through Republic facilities as a supervised, cohesive group. To anyone watching the formation, board a Venator-class Star Destroyer, they were indistinguishable from each other. Same age, same build, same white training fatigues, same measured compliance. Boba Fett was Jango's unaltered genetic template, not an accelerated growth clone, but genetically identical to the source material for every clone trooper in the Republic military. He was close enough, visually and physically, to pass the initial checks at any boarding verification point that screened for the right profile rather than the right chromosome markers. He took the identity of a cadet called Lucky and embedded himself in the formation before it boarded the Venator-class Star Destroyer Endurance. He was carrying a bomb. The StarWars.com episode summary states this directly. Boba Fett poses as a clone cadet and sneaks aboard a Jedi cruiser to plant a bomb in Mace Windu's personal quarters. Windu was aboard the Endurance. The mission objective was to reach his quarters before anyone in the ship's security apparatus connected the unfamiliar face to a threat assessment. The Endurance is 1,155 meters of active military warship, thousands of clone troopers, weapon systems operating continuously, standard security protocols running as designed. None of that mattered for the first phase, because the threat wasn't approaching from outside the security perimeter. It was already inside it, wearing the right uniform and standing in formation with the right unit. Boba moved through the Endurance with the Clone Youth Brigade, past the checkpoint architecture designed to intercept external boarding threats, past the blast door monitoring that a forced entry would have activated, and through the internal corridors until he reached Mace Windu's personal quarters on a 1,155-meter ship that Boba Fett had never seen before. He reached the room. He planted the bomb. He left the room walking, casually, in formation. The bomb detonated. Windu survived the blast. He wasn't in the room at the exact moment. Boba was still aboard, still operationally intact, and facing the choice between extraction and escalation. He escalated. He moved deeper into the Endurance, toward the reactor core command console, the nerve center of the ship's power plant. He reached it. He shot it directly. The Wikipedia entry for this event carries a specific and precisely chosen title: Sabotage of the Endurance. That designation is deliberate. This wasn't a fleet engagement, where the Venator's gun batteries and fighter complement met equivalent force in open space. It was targeted exploitation of a specific gap between the ship's designed defensive systems and the assumption underlying those systems, an assumption that turned out to be catastrophically wrong in practice. The resulting explosion was severe enough that the Endurance was rendered beyond repair. The crew evacuated. The ship eventually crashed. Boba was extracted by Aurra Sing and Bossk aboard Slave 1. He wasn't finished. In the follow-on episodes R2 Come Home and Lethal Trackdown, he coordinated a trap at the crash site. With both Mace Windu and Anakin Skywalker on the surface, Boba's team came within close range of a second decisive result. R2-D2 was instrumental in the escape. Boba was eventually taken into Republic custody after Aurra Sing abandoned him to avoid capture herself. Windu survived both attempts. The Endurance survived neither. The engineering critique of the Venator would note the reactor core console's accessibility as a structural failure, a critical vulnerability reachable by an infiltrator who bypassed perimeter defenses. The commander's critique would note that a non-clone infiltrating a clone formation should have been caught before he boarded the ship, let alone before he reached the Jedi Master's quarters 2 decks above. Both observations are accurate, and both miss the precise finding. The Venator's internal security operated on a single foundational assumption: that anyone in a clone trooper's uniform had been processed through the Republic's verified clone pipeline. Boba Fett was genetically close enough to a clone to defeat that assumption visually and behaviorally. The security design wasn't wrong in the abstract. It was wrong for a universe in which Jango Fett's unaltered genetic template was moving through Republic facilities with a specific operational objective and the patience to execute it methodically. The assumption that defined the system's limits was, in that specific situation, the only assumption that mattered. Call it a biological hazard, an adversary whose specific profile turned the Venator's institutional assumptions into fatal liabilities without engaging its actual defensive systems at any point in the sequence. A child with no capital ships, no force sensitivity, and no military backing destroyed a 1,155-meter warship through the gap between what the security architecture was designed to resist and what it was actually asked to face. The second biological hazard operated at a different scale, through a completely different mechanism, and with a level of situational intelligence that transformed an already catastrophic event into an escape that nothing the Venator's crew could do would have prevented. By Season 7, Episodes 9 through 12 of the Clone Wars, Darth Maul was holding Mandalore with whatever remained of the Shadow Collective after Palpatine had personally come to the planet to demonstrate Maul's actual position in the Sith hierarchy. That visit had not gone well for Maul. His network was gone. His brother was dead. What he retained was intelligence, specifically knowledge that Order 66 was coming, a rough sense of the timeline, and an understanding that being captured and transported aboard a Republic ship at the right moment was a better survival position than being on Mandalore when the Order arrived and clone forces began looking for unresolved liabilities. He arranged to be captured. Ahsoka Tano arrived above Mandalore with Republic forces that included the 332nd Company, a detachment drawn from the 501st Legion, their armor repainted in Ahsoka's orange and white color scheme rather than the 501st's signature blue. The repainting was Rex's gesture, a demonstration of loyalty to a commander who held no current rank in the Republic military and had no official standing to command anyone. The 332nd came in Ahsoka's colors because her brothers chose to. That detail matters in the final sequence because those distinctive markings would identify every clone in it. The ground assault across Sundari was sustained and brutal. Maul fought Ahsoka in an extended personal confrontation and lost. She captured him, restrained him, brought him aboard the Venator Star Destroyer in Republic custody. Alive, in chains, locked in the brig of a ship crewed entirely by clones programmed since gestation to follow orders. The Republic assessed this as a complete operational success. Order 66 activated. The inhibitor chips in every clone trooper aboard went live simultaneously. The 332nd Company, the men who had painted their armor in Ahsoka's colors as a gesture of personal loyalty, received the order in the same instant and turned on her. There was no escalation period, no warning window, no moment of hesitation visible in the episode. 1 second, Rex was standing in a corridor of his own ship. The next, every weapon in the 332nd was oriented at the Jedi she represented. In the brig, Maul registered what was happening through the Force. Ahsoka made a calculation. A contained Maul was no longer the primary threat aboard the ship. She freed him intentionally, using him as a distraction to create chaos among the troopers now hunting her. The containment systems never failed. They were bypassed by the person operating them. Maul moved through the ship not because Order 66 created an operational void in his cell's lock, but because Ahsoka opened it. He moved through the ship. The 332nd Company in orange and white were fighting Ahsoka simultaneously in the corridors between them and him. Maul used force-amplified close-quarters combat to cut through clone troopers blocking his path to an exit, not targeting the ship's reactor, not engaging any weapons systems, not doing anything that touched the Venators' designed defensive architecture. He was fighting people. The ship itself was running normally. The problem was that every person authorized to command it was either dead, being killed, or fighting for their lives in a different corridor. Rex's chip was active. He came after Ahsoka with the 332nd. She managed to capture him without killing him, got the chip out, and Rex came back to himself in the middle of his own brothers hunting his commander through their own ship. He helped her. Together, two people, one of whom had been actively trying to kill the other several minutes earlier, they navigated a crashing warship, kept each other alive through the descent, and reached an escape pod while the Venator came apart around them. Ahsoka later buried her fallen clones on the exterior hull of the ruined ship before leaving the site. The critical distinction between Maul's direct action and what Order 66 did needs to be stated clearly, because the engineering argument can't honestly claim the Mandalore crash as evidence. Maul didn't destroy the ship. Order 66 destroyed the ship by removing every person in its command structure within seconds of activation. Maul fought through the chaos that collapse generated to reach an exit, and Ahsoka's decision to free him was itself a product of that collapse, a commander improvising inside a catastrophe with no good options. His direct action was close-quarters combat against individual troopers, not sabotage, not structural damage, not any engagement with the ship as a technical system. The hull was functional throughout. The engines were presumably operational until command coherence reached total failure. What failed was the chain of command, and it failed because the Republic had constructed its entire military around a workforce with a remote activation loyalty override that a single executive order could flip simultaneously across the entire galaxy. That failure mode would have destroyed any ship design that depended on clone crews. It wasn't a Venator vulnerability. It was a Republic doctrine catastrophe of the First Order, and the ship's design specifications had nothing useful to say about it. What the Mandalore sequence demonstrates about commanders is separate and worth stating precisely. Ahsoka's training, her relationship with Rex, and her knowledge of how the inhibitor chips functioned produced the only two survivors from a command collapse that should have killed everyone aboard who wasn't a clone. The Venator under her command, inside the worst operational scenario the Republic could have generated, yielded a survivable outcome because the person commanding it understood things other Jedi commanders didn't know to understand. Taken together, Boba Fett and Darth Maul present the same fundamental finding through methods that couldn't be more different. Neither engaged the Venators' designed defensive systems in the way the engineering debate imagines. Neither needed a hull weakness. They found the gap between the ship's formidable external capabilities and the human systems supporting them, and they moved through it, one slowly and patiently over weeks with a child's patience, the other instantly and opportunistically with a Sith's sense of timing. The armor didn't fail. The institutional assumptions failed. The engineering argument and the commander's argument meet in exactly that gap, and neither owns it entirely. There's a version of the Venator's operational history where neither the Endurance nor the Mandalore ship reaches those outcomes, where the fleet composition the Venator was designed to operate within was actually present. The Victory-class Star Destroyer was another Kuat Drive Yards product, with a more conventional ship-of-the-line profile and anti-fighter defensive capabilities oriented differently from the Venator's carrier-forward design. The doctrinal concept it represented was a mixed battle group, providing mutual coverage. The Victory class covering the anti-fighter and close-range defensive gaps that a carrier priority design consciously deprioritized. The Venator providing the heavy gun batteries and starfighter operations that the battle group's offensive capability depended on. The specific claim that the Victory class was formally designated in written Republic doctrine as the Venator's standard escort isn't confirmed in the available sources. Both classes were in Republic service during the Clone Wars. Both were KDY products, and mixed formations were a real concept in Republic naval organization. The doctrinal relationship existed, even if the formal specification isn't fully documented. The question that matters is how consistently that doctrine matched practice. The Republic scaled from essentially zero standing military to a galaxy-wide naval war in weeks, from the emergency clone army procurement following Geonosis to the sustained multi-front campaign that followed within months. Assembling the correct fleet composition for every engagement required production rates, logistical coordination, and strategic allocation that a procurement system operating under 1,000 years of Ruusan Reformation's constraints couldn't simply generate on demand across every front simultaneously. Commanders drew from what was available, deployed where the war required them, and fought with the formation they had, rather than the formation doctrine preferred. The pattern in the Venator's worst outcomes supports this reading consistently. At Christophsis, 3 Venators in mutual support formation, Anakin's asymmetric tactics, successful outcome. The Endurance, a single ship with a specific internal security failure exploited by one actor with no supporting fleet present. The Mandalore Venator, a single ship with no external threat at all, destroyed by its own command collapse. The Venator's most exposed moments occurred repeatedly when it was operating without the formation context its dual-role design assumed it would have. That's not an engineering failure. That's a deployment gap, the difference between what doctrine specified and what logistics delivered. A ship that performs well in formation and fails in isolation is behaving exactly as designed. Calling that a design flaw requires ignoring the conditions the design was built for, which is a different kind of analytical error. The audience's instinct that the Venator was orphaned rather than flawed is coherent, and the evidence supports it more than the engineering critique does. Kuat Drive Yards built the Venator. Kuat Drive Yards also built the Imperial-class Star Destroyer that replaced it. That sentence sits quietly behind the entire arc of the Venator's service life, and deserves to be examined directly. The Imperial class is heavier, more conventionally armed as a ship of the line, substantially less carrier-forward than the Venator. Its profile reflects a preference for overwhelming broadside firepower over combined arms flexibility. The transition from Venator to Imperial class represented an organizational shift in what the galaxy's primary capital warship was supposed to do. KDY sold the Republic the Venator for 3 years of the Clone Wars. KDY then sold the Empire the Imperial class as the solution to the Venator's limitations. The company that identified and documented those limitations was the same company that designed both the ship being replaced and the ship doing the replacing. The financial logic of that sequence runs directly through a single procurement cycle. Build the Venator under Ruusan Reformation's armament constraints. Collect the production contracts. Operate the ship through a major galactic conflict. Document the capability gaps those constraints created. Design a replacement that the Ruusan Reformations no longer limit because the Empire abolished those constraints the moment Palpatine reorganized the government. Sell the replacement to the same institutional customer now operating under a completely different legal framework and collect the new contracts. At every stage, KDY was the only entity with the technical knowledge, the production infrastructure, and the institutional positioning to shape both the problem statement and its solution. This doesn't prove the Venator was deliberately engineered for obsolescence. The Ruusan Reformation's constraints were real, and KDY's engineers were genuinely working within them. But the structural conflict of interest is real and documented. The company financially incentivized to sell a replacement product was also the company defining whether a replacement was necessary. The Republic appears never to have formally addressed that conflict. Nobody outside KDY had the technical expertise and production access to independently evaluate whether the Venator had reached genuine capability limits, or whether those limits were being characterized in terms that served KDY's next contract cycle. The company that diagnosed the Venator as insufficient had a specific financial incentive to reach exactly that diagnosis. That's context. It belongs in the after-action report. It isn't a verdict. After the Clone Wars, the Empire made its decision. The Venator had served as the backbone of the Republic Navy across 3 years of sustained galaxy-wide conflict. It had anchored the Open Circle Armada through the Outer Rim sieges, carried the 501st Legion across dozens of fronts, and served as the operational instrument of the Clone Wars' most consistently effective naval commanders. The rise of Darth Vader, set in the immediate aftermath of Order 66, references Darth Vader's early Imperial flagship, the Exactor, as unlike its Venator-class predecessors. That phrasing is careful and precise. The Venator is present in the early Imperial period, recognizable as a distinct prior category, and already being explicitly distinguished from what the new regime's warships were supposed to represent. The Empire retired it anyway. 2 readings of that decision follow directly from the 2 arguments this script has been building, and they produce entirely different conclusions from the same historical fact. The engineering argument's reading is internally consistent. The Empire assessed the Republic's capital ship inventory, evaluated the Venator's documented capability gaps, and concluded the Imperial class better served its military doctrine. The new Empire wasn't fighting a multi-front counterinsurgency requiring combined arms carrier flexibility. It was projecting overwhelming force against a pacified population to enforce compliance. For that mission, a ship optimized for broadside firepower rather than carrier operations made operational sense. The Venator's trade-offs, genuine products of Ruusan Reformation's constraints and dual-role design compromises, didn't fit the Empire's requirements for what a capital warship should be. If you believe the engineering argument, the Empire's retirement confirms it. The limitations were real. The replacement was necessary. KDY's assessment was correct. The commander's argument's reading runs parallel, but lands somewhere darker. If the Venator's worst outcomes came from specific actors it faced, and specific command decisions driving its deployment, rather than fundamental hull limitations, if the ship was capable, merely orphaned from its intended formation, then the Empire's retirement says something about Imperial priorities rather than engineering realities. The Venator carried the Open Circle Fleet's markings. It carried Ahsoka Tano to Mandalore and the 332nd Company to their last assignment. It was the instrument of Republic naval power at its most operationally effective, and its hull was built into the institutional identity of every Republic formation that flew it for 3 years. The Empire had a specific incentive to erase that identity. Retiring the Venator and replacing it with something that belonged exclusively to the New Order was a political act as much as a military evaluation. And Kuat Drive Yards, positioned to capture 2 consecutive procurement cycles from the same customer through the same transition, benefited from both the political rationale and the engineering argument simultaneously, regardless of which one was actually decisive. The Empire was capable of all of this at once. An institution that executed a galaxy-wide political coup on the same morning it flipped its entire clone army's loyalty through a remote activation signal wasn't operating on single motives. It could evaluate the Venator's genuine capability gaps, calculate the political value of removing Republic hardware from the Imperial fleet's visual identity, and accept KDY's transitional contract on terms that served every interested party simultaneously. These aren't competing explanations. They may all be true at the same time. The Imperial class was probably a better ship for Imperial doctrine specifically. The Venator was probably capable enough that the retirement was overdetermined, pushed by politics, symbolism, and financial incentives on top of whatever genuine engineering argument existed. The Venator lost the argument, not because it was wrong about itself, but because it was being evaluated by a government that had already decided what the answer needed to be. What remains across the entire record is a vessel that served through one of the most intense periods of sustained naval warfare in galactic history, and performed at a level that neither the engineering argument nor any other single frame of analysis fully captures. It won campaigns that should have been losses. It lost ships to actors who found the gap between its capable exterior and its institutional assumptions, not to anything Kuat Drive Yards put in the hull. It was present at Order 66 and absorbed the consequences of a doctrine failure that no ship design in the Republic's inventory could have survived intact. It was commanded by the most operationally effective and the most emotionally volatile officers the Republic produced simultaneously, because those were often the same person, standing on the same bridge above the same planet. The engineering argument says the Venator's trade-offs created vulnerabilities that outcomes confirmed. The commander's argument says those outcomes are better explained by who was standing on the bridge and who was moving through the corridors than by anything in the design specification. The political argument says neither reading survives full contact with the procurement cycle that produced the Venator and then retired it at a moment commercially convenient for its manufacturer. None of these arguments is complete. None is entirely wrong. The original video made a choice about which argument to emphasize. The gap it left was real, and the case for filling it runs through 3 years of documented Open Circle fleet operations, one 10-year-old's operational planning, a Sith Lord's sense of timing, and a defense manufacturer that sold the galaxy the same story twice. Whether the gap changes the conclusion, whether the variable was the hull or the humans, that's the call you're going to have to make yourself. The record doesn't close the question, it opens it. Subscribe if you want to keep arguing about it. This conversation is open.